The Brothers Karamazov by Fyodor Dostoevsky. Book 1. A Peculiar Family History. Chapter 2. He Gets Rid of His Eldest Son. It is, of course, easy to imagine what sort of father such a man would be, how he would bring up his children, and he lived up to expectation. He completely and thoroughly neglected his child by Adelaida. He did not do so out of any deliberate malice or resentment toward the child's mother, but simply because he forgot all about the little boy, and while he was pestering people with his tears and self-pitying stories, while he was turning his home into a house of debauchery, a faithful servant of the household, Gregory, took the 3-year-old Mitya into his care. If it hadn't been for Gregory, there would have been no change to the boy's shirt. Moreover, it so happened that the child's relations on his mother's side had also, at first, forgotten his existence. Mitya's grandfather, that is, Adelaida's father, Mr. Musov, was no longer alive. His widow, Mitya's grandmother, had moved to Moscow, and was in very poor health. And in the meantime, Adelaida's sisters had married and moved away, so Mitya spent almost a year in Gregory's little house in the servants' quarters. And even if his father had occasionally remembered him, he could not, after all, have been completely unaware of the child's existence. Karamazov would have sent his son back to the servants' quarters anyway, because a child would have been in the way during the orgies. But one day a first cousin of Adelaida's returned from Paris, Peter Musov, who was later to settle abroad permanently, was at that time still a young man, but he was already an exception among the Musovs. He was an enlightened, big-city gentleman, glittering with foreign polish, a European through and through, who, in later life, was to become a typical liberal of the 1840s and 1850s. In the course of his life, he came in contact with some of the most liberal minds of his era, both in Russia and abroad. He met Proudhon personally, as well as Buchanan, and, toward the end of his wanderings, liked the best to tell of his experiences during the 3 days of the February Revolution of 1848, which he had witnessed in Paris, implying that he himself had taken part in it, just short, perhaps, of manning the barricades. This was one of the most gratifying recollections of his youth. He was a man of independent means, with an income from an estate of 1,000-odd souls, as property was evaluated in the old days. That splendid estate was located just outside our town and bordered on the lands of our famous monastery. No sooner had young Peter Musov taken possession of his estate than he started an endless lawsuit against the monastery. It was something about fishing privileges or woodcutting rights. I'm not sure which, but he felt that in suing clericals, he was doing his duty as a citizen and an enlightened man. When Musov heard what had happened to Adelaida, whom he, of course, remembered having even, at one time, taken a special interest in her, and when he learned of Mitya's plight, he decided to intervene, although that involved approaching Karamazov, whom Musov loathed and despised with all the ardor of youth. This was the first time that he had met Fyodor Karamazov. He told him point-blank that he wished to take the boy and be responsible for his education. Later he'd like to tell at length what had happened at that meeting, because he felt it revealed a great deal about Karamazov's character. When Musov first broached the subject of Mitya, the fellow stared at him blankly, as though he could not understand what child Musov was talking about, and he seemed positively taken aback when reminded that he had a young son. And although Musov's story may have been exaggerated, there was certainly an element of truth in it. It is a fact that all his life Karamazov liked to act the fool and assume all sorts of surprising roles. He would do so even when he had nothing to gain. Indeed, even when it could be positively to his disadvantage, as in this instance. This is a quirk found in many people, even very clever ones, let alone the likes of Fyodor Karamazov. Musov at first went about the matter with some zest, and was even appointed Mitya's guardian, jointly with Karamazov, since the boy had, after all, the small estate in the townhouse coming to him as his inheritance from his mother, and he moved the boy to his house. But not being tied down by a family of his own, just as soon as he had wound up his business in our town, which consisted of collecting the revenue from his estate, he went dashing off to Paris for a long stay. He left the boy in the care of a relative of his, a lady who lived in Moscow. Musov settled in Paris for good and lost sight of Mitya, his interest in the boy petering out completely after the February Revolution, which made such an ineradicable impression on him. In the meantime, the Moscow lady died, and Mitya passed into the care of one of her married daughters. I believe he had to change homes for a fourth time soon afterward. I won't expand on this topic here, since I will have a great deal to say after about this firstborn son of Fyodor Karamazov's, but I must supply a few facts right away, without which I could not even begin my novel. First of all, Mitya, that is, Dmitry Fyodorovich Karamazov, was the only one of Fyodor Pavlovich Karamazov's son who grew up under the impression that, however hard up he might be, he would, when he came of age, come into his inheritance from his mother, and that he would then be financially independent. He was unruly as a boy, and as a young man. He dropped out of the classical secondary school, but later was admitted to military school. From there he was sent on active duty with an army unit in the Caucasus, where he was given an officer's commission in the field. He was soon demoted to the ranks for fighting a duel, only to be restored to his rank again for gallantry. After this he led a wild, gay life that cost a good deal of money, since, until he came of age, he never received a single kopeck from his father. He was deep in debt by the time that day arrived. He only met and got to know the old man when he came to our town to demand an accounting of the estate left him by his mother. It would appear that, even then, Dmitri took a dislike to his father. He stayed at the paternal house only a short time, leaving as soon as he had managed to get a very small sum from the old man, together with some vague agreement about sending him the revenue from his estate. It must be noted here that on this occasion Dmitri failed to find out from his father what the total worth of his estate was, or what income it yielded. Karamazov discovered right away, and this must be noted too, that his son had an erroneous and exaggerated notion of his inheritance, and this discovery pleased him, for it fitted in with his own schemes. He realized that the young man was irresponsible, violent, passionate, unruly, impatient, and that he couldn't wait to satisfy all his whims and impulses. And Karamazov now knew how to handle Dmitri. The fellow could always be placated, at least temporarily, with small handouts. Karamazov proceeded immediately to exploit his son's weakness, putting him off with small sums. This went on for 4 years until finally Dmitri lost patience. He made a second appearance in town, this time to force on his father a final settlement of their accounts. He was quite stunned to hear from Karamazov that he had already received, in the many installments, a sum amounting to the value of his estate, that is, that, if anything, it was he who was now in debt to his father, and that, moreover, in view of such and such an agreement, which he himself had insisted upon at one point, he had renounced all further claims, etc., etc. The young man was dumbfounded, accused his father of cheating him, and acted as if he would go out of his mind. It was this confrontation between Karamazov and his eldest son that led to the catastrophe which is the subject, or at least the external plot, of my first preliminary novel. But before I start on that narrative, I will have to say a few words about Karamazov's other sons and explain their origins.